Come with me, if you will, to the first book of Chronicles in chapter 1. In Genesis chapter 12 that we just read, we have, don't we, the call of Abraham. And for a few minutes, I wanted to spend a few moments just looking at the context to this and seeing how that this is not the start of a new section in the book of Genesis. It's not something new with the call of Abraham, but it's building on that which has gone before, a continuation and a contrast to the chapters that have come previously. So come with me to the first book of Chronicles in chapter 1, and we have, don't we, the record of the genealogies, starting there in verse 1 with Adam. And then in verse 4 we come down to Noah and to his sons, Shem, Ham and Japheth. And so verse 5 continues with the sons of Japheth. Verse 8 we have the sons of Ham. And then in verse 17 we come to the sons of Shem. And we read there in verse 17 of 1 Chronicles chapter 1, the sons of Shem, Elam and Asher and Arphaxad, and Lud, and Aram, and Uz, and Hul, and Gether, and Meshech. And Arphaxad begat Shelah, and Shelah begat Eber. And unto Eber were born 2 sons. The name of the one was Peleg, because in his days the earth was divided. And his brother's name was Joktan. And Joktan begat Almodad, and Sheleph, and Hazarmaveth, and Jerah, Hadoram also, and Uzal, and Diklah. And Ebal, and Abimael, and Sheba, and Ophir, and Havilah, and Jobab. All these were the sons of Joktan. And so there then we have a list of the sons of Shem. And we come down to verse 19 and we see that Eber had 2 sons. The name of the one was Peleg, because in his days the earth was divided, and his brother's name is Joktan. But there's no focus here on Peleg. We're told that he existed, we're told why he was given that name, but we're told nothing else about him. Verse 20 then continues with the sons of Joktan. And it goes down one generation and then stops. And then in verse 23, the genealogy starts again, and we're back with Shem once again. Shem, Arphaxad, Shelah, Eber, Peleg. And now this time there's no mention of Joktan, but we continue with the sons of Peleg. Reu, Serug, Nahor, Terah, and then on down to Abraham. This genealogy is separated out for us into these 2 divisions, as it were, of the sons of Eber. If we just look back at verse 8 to the sons of Ham, we read there that there was Cush and Mizraim and Put and Canaan, and then it goes on in verse 9 to describe for us the sons of Cush. We come down then to verse 11, and it jumps back up to Mizraim, but it doesn't start again with Ham. It just jumps back to where it needs to. Likewise, verse 13 with Canaan. We've been introduced to Canaan, and so it just starts there and continues. But when we get down to verse 24, that same pattern does not continue. It doesn't just start off with Peleg and continue with his generation. It goes back to Shem and continues all the way down that genealogy again, this time getting to Eber, this time but not mentioning Joktan, that other son, but just focusing on Peleg. And so why then is this genealogy recorded for us in this way? Why did it go all the way back to Shem to come back down the other son of Eber? Well, the first book of Chronicles is not the only place that this genealogy is divided in this way. And so come back now to the book of Genesis and to Genesis in chapter 10. In Genesis chapter 10, again, we have the generations of Noah. And so in Genesis chapter 10 and verse 1, now these are the generations of the son of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And so that's similar, isn't it, to 1 Chronicles 1 verse 4 that we read a few moments ago. And so verse 2 has the sons of Japheth and goes on to list them. Verse 6, we have the sons of Ham. And then we come down to verse 21. And we read there, unto Shem also, the father of all the children of Eber. Well, that's interesting that it should mention Eber there, isn't it? Of all those descendants who it mentions Eber. That one where that genealogy in Chronicles splits. It was the 2 sons of Eber, where the genealogy was divided. And now we are being told that Shem was the father of all the children of Eber. And so verse 22, the children of Shem, Elam and Asher and Arphaxad and Lud and Aram. And so it goes on, as we had in Chronicles. To verse 25, and unto Eber were born 2 sons. The name of the one was Peleg, for in his days was the earth divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. And then it goes on again in verse 26 to 29 to list those sons of Joktan. Just like that first genealogy in Chronicles, we start with Shem and we get to Eber. We're told that Eber had 2 sons. We're told the name of Peleg and the reason why he was called Peleg, but nothing else. And the record focuses on Joktan and again goes down one generation looking at all his sons. And then verse 29, at the end of the verse, all these were the sons of Joktan, and the record stops there. And now coming to chapter 11 and verse 10. These are the generations of Shem. Well, we know the generations of Shem, don't we? We've just read them in chapter 10, verse 22. And again, it continues down to verse 14, to Eber. And verse 16, and Eber lived 34 years and begat Peleg. Only one son again mentioned. Joktan again, just like the second genealogy in Chronicles, is not mentioned. And the record continues with Peleg and on down to Abraham at the end of verse 26. And so why then is this genealogy recorded for us in this way on two separate occasions? To divide this family. To list the whole family tree twice, but focus on the different sons of Eber. To mention in verse 21 that Shem was the father of all the children of Eber. What is the significance of these two sons of Eber? That these families and these generations are split in this way. Well, there is two main differences really between the records in Genesis and Chronicles. The first is the way that the second genealogy in Genesis 11 is divided with all the ages and the time periods. But in Chronicles, both of those genealogies were back to back, weren't they? We went from one straight into the other. But in Genesis, there is another section of Scripture which is put in between these two genealogies. So if we come back to Genesis chapter 10 and verse 29, we got down to, these are all the sons of Joktan. Verse 30, their dwelling was from Mesha, as thou goest unto Sephir, a mount of the east. And then we come into chapter 11 and verse 1. And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. And it came to pass as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar. And they dwelt there. And your margin might be similar to mine, where it says that from the east, you better be translated to go eastward. That they journeyed eastward and found that plain in the land of Shinar. Which, of course, we know, don't we, the links to Babylon. And so verse 3, and they said one to another, go to, let us make brick, and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar. And they said, go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. And see how both those verses 3 and 4 both start off with, and they said. Verse 4, they had gone with a purpose to build themselves a city and a tower, to make themselves a name. And we see how that they were scattered abroad, don't we, and their speech confounded. Verse 7, God says, go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So Yahweh scattered them abroad from thence, upon the face of all the earth. And so having listed the sons of Joktan, and having said that they were dwelling on that mount on the east in verse 30, the narrative moves on to look at a group who moved east. Those who were building themselves a city and a tower, looking to make themselves a name. And we see how that there was a scattering and a confounding. And I wonder whether this is that division that's mentioned there in chapter 10 and verse 25, when we're told of Peleg. For in his days was the earth divided. And here, of course, is that division, isn't it? Chapter 11, the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. There was unity there. And now we have this confounding and this scattering. And so, having looked at the sons of Joktan, we go down that one generation. And it stops. And then we're told about this group who went east. And then there was scattering. And so it stops. And then we start again, as we've seen in chapter 11, verse 10, with the genealogy once more, this time coming down through the genealogy through Peleg. And then we come into chapter 12 and verse 1, and we read, now Yahweh had said unto Abraham. Well, that's the contrast, isn't it, to chapter 11, verses 3 and 4, where they said one to another. What did God say in verse 1? Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee, and I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great. Let us make us a name, is what we read in chapter 11. Now Abraham is told that God would make his name great. And of course, Abraham was not building himself a city and a tower, was he? But as we read in Hebrews 11, which we'll go to later on, he dwelt in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob, looking for a city which hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God. And that he desired a better country, that is, an heavenly. Wherefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he hath prepared for them a city. And so Abraham, having listened to God speaking and obeyed, headed west, didn't he? With that promise that his name would be made great, looking for that future city. And of course he headed west from Ur of the Chaldees to Canaan, in contrast to those in chapter 11 heading the other way, heading eastward. And having come into that land in chapter 12 and verse 7, Yahweh appeared unto Abraham and said, Unto thy seed will I give this land. And there builded he an altar unto Yahweh, who appeared unto him. And he removed from thence unto a mountain of the east of Bethel, and pitched his tent, having Bethel on the west and Hai on the east. And there he builded an altar unto Yahweh, and called upon the name of Yahweh. Not building a city or a tower, but an altar to worship his God. And so I think this is the reason why this genealogy is divided. I think we have these two sons of Eber being contrasted for us in chapters 11 and chapters 12. The sons of Joktan journeying east, building themselves a city and a tower, making themselves a name, and then cut off from the scriptural record for doing that, whilst the line through Peleg continues, giving us an example of the complete opposite, of one worshipping God, following his command, listening to him, one who God would build a city for, one who God would make his name to be great. And so there's a question for ourselves, isn't there, brothers and sisters and friends? Are we of the sons of Joktan, or of the sons of Peleg? Are we like those in Genesis chapter 11, looking to make ourselves a name? Or are we like Abraham, calling upon the name of Yahweh? We'll come back now then to Genesis chapter 12 and verse 1. And we read there that Yahweh had said unto Abraham. That's past tense, isn't it? So we ask the question, well, when was this? When had God spoken unto Abraham? And come with me to the Acts of the Apostles and chapter 7. And here we are given the answer. And in Acts chapter 7 we come, don't we, to the time of Stephen, when he has been brought before the council. And in Acts chapter 7 he goes on, doesn't he, to give his defence before that council. Acts chapter 7 and verse 2. Stephen said, Men, brethren and fathers, hearken. The God of glory appeared unto our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he dwelt in Haran, and said unto him, Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred, and come into the land which I shall show thee. Then came he out of the land of the Chaldeans, and dwelt in Haran. And from thence, when his father was dead, he removed him into this land, wherein ye now dwell. The God of glory appeared unto our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he dwelt in Haran. And so with that in mind, if we come back to Genesis chapter 12, we see how that these words had been said to Abraham back in chapter 11. Because in chapter 11 and verse 31, Terah took Abraham his son, and Lot, the son of Haran his son's son, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son Abraham's wife, and they went forth with them from Ur of the Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan. And they came unto Haran and dwelt there. And so we're told in Acts chapter 7 that the words in chapter 12 and verse 1 appear before verse 31 of Genesis chapter 11. This was before he had left Mesopotamia, before he had left Ur of the Chaldees, before he went into the land of Haran. And if we just read chapter 11 and verse 31, it would seem, wouldn't it, that Terah knew where he was going. We read there that he took Abraham his son and the rest of them, and they went forth with them from Ur of the Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan. It reads as though that was the intention. Terah took his family and said, we go into the land of Canaan. But as we know from Hebrews, Abraham did not know where he was going. He was being called and being led by God. He was being shown the way by God. This was not Terah's doing. Terah did not know where they were going. And I wonder if that's why we read in verse 31, they went forth with them. Whether that them is the angels who are leading them to the land of Canaan. They themselves did not know, as we see in Hebrews, where they were going. They were led by God to go to Haran and from thence into Canaan. But in chapter 12 and verse 1, Abraham was given 3 commands, wasn't he? He was to get out of the country, he was to remove himself from his kindred, and he was to leave his father's house. And of course that getting out of the country was started there with Terah in verse 31. But as we read in Acts, and as we see there at the end of chapter 11, Terah dies in the land of Haran. And so Abraham then continues alone without his father towards the land of Canaan. But of course there was still another command, another part too, wasn't there? He had to separate himself fully from the kindred and from his father's house. And we might say, well, why? Why did he have to separate himself completely from his father's house? Why could he not take his family with him? We'll keep something in Genesis 12. We're coming back here shortly, but come over to Joshua and chapter 24. And in Joshua chapter 24, we come to the time when Joshua has gathered all the people together shortly before he dies. And he gives them the final words of encouragement. Joshua chapter 24 and verse 1. Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel to Shechem and called for the elders of Israel and for their heads and for their judges and for their officers. And they presented themselves before God. And Joshua said unto all the people, Thus saith Yahweh God of Israel, Your fathers dwelt on the other side of the flood in old time, even Terah the father of Abraham and the father of Nahor, and they served other gods. Within Abraham's family, they were worshipping other gods. There was idolatry within that family. And so Abraham was called to separate himself from that family, to remove himself from that idolatry, to give himself wholly to God. And of course, this separation would later be achieved with the separation from Lot in chapter 13, which we're not going to consider this evening. But come over to Isaiah and chapter 51. Because again here we see how that it was Abraham alone that was called by God to leave Mesopotamia, to leave the Ur of the Chaldees. Isaiah chapter 51 and verse 1. We read, Hearken to me, ye that follow after righteousness, ye that seek Yahweh. Look unto the rock whence ye are hewn, and to the hole of the pit whence ye are digged. Look unto Abraham your father, and unto Sarah that bare you. For I called him alone, and blessed him, and increased him. I called him alone, God says. And that word alone there is elsewhere translated one, or first. It's there in Genesis chapter 1, on the first day of creation. We get it in chapter 2 and verse 21 of Genesis, where we read how that God took one rib out of the side of Adam to create Eve. And it's again there later in Genesis chapter 2, where we read of Adam and Eve that they twain would be one flesh. God had called one Abraham. And so this separation had to be a complete separation from his family, from his kindred, from the country from whence he had come. And it's only once Abraham had done all three, following the separation from Lot in chapter 13, that those promises were reiterated to him. And Abraham was shown the land that his seed would inherit. Come over to the book of Psalms and to Psalm 45. Psalm 45 is one of the psalms for the sons of Korah. And in this psalm we have a depiction of Christ and of his bride. We haven't got time to look at the psalm in any detail. I want to pick out a couple of verses. In Psalm 45 and verse 10, talking to the bride of Christ. Hearken, O daughter, and consider, and incline thine ear. Forget also thine own people, Forget also thine own people and thy father's house. So shall the king greatly desire thy beauty, for he is thy Lord, and worship thou him. And so, brothers and sisters, as that bride of Christ, do we forget our own people and our Father's house? Do we leave behind those things of the world? Are we truly strangers and pilgrims on the earth? Or do we have that country that we need to leave behind? That kindred. We read in Revelation chapter 18 and verse 4, "Come out of her, my people, that ye be not partakers of her sins, and that ye receive not of her plagues." Yes, have we left that land like Abraham? Have we left behind our father's house and that kindred to dedicate ourselves wholly to our God? Well, we're not going to spend any time this evening looking at those promises that Abraham was given in the first few verses of Genesis chapter 12. And so we're just going to jump down to verse 4, where we see how that Abraham departs in obedience. He departed as Yahweh had spoken unto him, and Lot went with him. And then we come down to verse 6, and we read there that Abraham passed through the land unto the place of Sichem, unto the plain of Moreh, and the Canaanite was then in the land. My Bible in the margin for the plain of Moreh says the oak of Moreh. And that place becomes a very important place within the pages of Scripture. Come over to chapter 35, to the time of Abraham's grandson, Jacob. Genesis chapter 35 and verse 1. We read there that God said unto Jacob, "Arise, go up to Bethel." And we haven't quite got there yet, but we'll see Bethel in Genesis chapter 12 and verse 8 in a few minutes. But Jacob's told to arise and go up to Bethel and dwell there and make there an altar unto God, just as Abraham did. Make an altar unto God that appeared unto thee when thou fleddest from the face of Esau thy brother. And Jacob said unto his household, and to all that were with him, "Put away the strange gods that are among you, and be clean, and change your garments, and let us arise and go up to Bethel. And I will make there an altar unto God, who answered me in the day of my distress, and was with me in the way which I went." And so just as Abraham was called to leave behind the idolatry of his father's house, so too now Jacob tells his house to leave behind those strange gods which were with them. And so verse 4, "They gave unto Jacob all the strange gods which were in their hand, and all their earrings which were in their ears, and Jacob hid them under the oak which was by Shechem." Whether it is exactly the same oak, I don't think we can be sure, but the way it says there, "the oak which was in Shechem," would to me suggest it was. That same oak which Abraham came to was that one where Jacob would later bury those strange gods. And we could go again to Joshua chapter 24 and see how that occasion we were looking at earlier, how that at that point in time a stone was reared up under the oak in Shechem. If we come now to Deuteronomy in chapter 11, we come to the time shortly before Israel were due to cross into that land. And they are given the blessings and the cursings. The blessings if they obeyed, and the curses if they turned aside and went after other gods. Deuteronomy chapter 11 and verse 29. "It shall come to pass when Yahweh thy God hath brought thee into the land whither thou goest to possess it, that thou shalt put the blessing upon Mount Gerizim and the curse upon Mount Ebal. Are they not on the other side Jordan, by the way where the sun goeth down, in the land of the Canaanites, which dwell in the champaign over against Gilgal, beside the plains, the oak of Moreh?" It's that same word that we get in Genesis. It was this point where those blessings and the cursings were to be recounted. That very place which Abraham had travelled to was where they were to leave behind the other gods which their fathers had worshipped. And it was now the place where those blessings and those cursings were to be recounted. Well, back in Genesis chapter 12 once more, and verse 7, we read again how that Abraham came and builded an altar. And throughout Genesis we see that Hebrew word builded. We've already seen the comparison with chapter 11, the building of the Tower of Babel. But that word appears in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 22, where we read that God took Abraham's rib and made and built a woman. It's the same word. We see Cain building the city and calling it Enoch. We see Noah building an altar unto Yahweh. We see Nimrod building Nineveh and other cities. And we also get it in chapter 16 and verse 2, where Sarai gives her handmaid to Abraham that he might obtain children by her. And that word translated children is the same word translated build. And so this building is done in two different ways, isn't it? There's two contrasting things that are built. There are some things which are built to give glory to God, to worship God. And there are other things which are built, cities and towers, for people to make themselves a name. And so there's another question for us, brothers and sisters. What are we building? Come over to the prophecy of Haggai and Haggai chapter 1. And in Haggai, we come, don't we, to the time after the exile when the children of Israel are returning back to their land. Haggai chapter 1 and verse 4. Haggai says, "Is it time for you, O ye, to dwell in your sealed houses, and this house lie waste?" In Haggai's day, they were building their own houses rather than the house of God. Just as in Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel was being built instead of altars to Yahweh in chapter 12. And so Haggai was sent to rebuke them, to return their focus to that of the temple. Verse 7, "Thus saith Yahweh of hosts, consider your ways, go up to the mountain and bring wood and build the house, and I will take pleasure in it, and I will be glorified, saith Yahweh." And so we read in verse 14 that Yahweh stirred up the spirit of Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah. And so we read at the end of the verse that they came and did work in the house of Yahweh of hosts, their God. And we could go to Corinthians and see how there's a similar exhortation to us as well, to ensure that we are building that which is right before our God. Back in Genesis chapter 12, the record moves on to say that Abraham removed from thence unto a mountain on the east of Bethel, and pitched his tent, having Bethel on the west and Hai on the east. And again he builds another altar. And we saw earlier the contrast between chapter 11 and chapter 12. In chapter 11 they're journeying eastward. And in chapter 12 we saw how Abraham was coming west from the Ur of the Chaldees into the land of Canaan. And throughout Scripture there is a contrast between journeying east and west. And we see how that, generally speaking, journeying east is going away from God, whereas journeying west is heading towards God. It comes up first of all in Genesis chapter 2, when God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and man was put therein. And then after the fall, man was driven out, and the cherubim were positioned on the east of Eden to keep the way to the tree of life, to keep that which was to its west. And we read how that Cain dwelt on the east of Eden. Man had gone east, away from God. We get it again in Numbers, where the tabernacle, the position, the orientation of the tabernacle. And we see how that Moses and Aaron's sons were encamped on the east to keep the charge of the sanctuary, again to their west. So you can see that again there's that east to west comparison, that they were there to prevent somebody coming from the east into the west who was not supposed to be. It's there again with the temple in Chronicles, and it's a pattern we get all the way through Scripture. And we have it here in chapter 12 and verse 8. We read there that Abraham pitched his tent, having Bethel, the house of God, on the west, and Hai on the east. And according to Josephus, Hai means a heap of ruins. If Abraham was to journey west, he would go to the house of God. If he was to go to the east, he would go to a heap of ruins. And so again, we ask, well, which way are we travelling, brothers and sisters? Are we spiritually heading towards God? Are we heading west? Or are we heading east towards the things of man? But at this point in Abraham's journeyings, it must have seemed now that his journey was over. He had been brought by God to the land of Canaan, to a land which he had been told would be given to his seed. That journey was done. But then in verse 10, there was a famine in the land. And this would probably have been quite unexpected to Abraham. He had been called by God to be in this land. He had been brought there. God was with him. And now there was a famine. He had been called by God to live there. But now there was no sustenance for his household, for his flock, or for his herds. And so he journeys on again, doesn't he? Down into Egypt in verse 10 to sojourn there. For the famine was grievous in the land. In the first 7 or 8 verses of chapter 12, we don't hear of Abraham saying anything. God speaks, and Abraham obeys. And that's the way that the first few verses are structured for us. God tells Abraham what to do, and Abraham does it. But now we have a contrast. Now there is no record of God speaking. But we do have a record of Abraham speaking. No longer do we have Abraham obeying the words of God, but we have Abraham deciding what he would do. Verse 11, it came to pass, when he was come near to enter into Egypt, that he said unto Sarai his wife, Behold, now I know that thou art a fair woman to look upon. Therefore it shall come to pass, when the Egyptians shall see thee, that they shall say, This is his wife, and they will kill me, but they will save thee alive. They will kill me, he said. But God had just told him, or if they just told him, had told him back in chapter 12, verse 1 and verse 2, that I will make of thee a great nation. There was no way in which Abraham could be killed in the land of Egypt. God had promised that a great nation would come from him. And as of yet, he did not have a son. It was not possible that Abraham could go down into Egypt and be killed. It seems that Abraham's faith has waned at this time. He is no longer listening to God. Perhaps at that shock of this famine coming upon him, God's brought him here, and now there's no food. They will kill me, but they will save thee alive. Genesis chapter 12 is not the only time we read of this set of events, of Abraham going to another land in a time of trouble. We get it again in chapter 20, when he goes this time into the south country, to Abimelech, king of Gerar. And we get very similar things in Genesis chapter 26 with Isaac. And we'll just spend a few moments just drawing some of the links between these three passages. So we're sort of trying to see as much of Genesis 12, Genesis 20 and Genesis 26 as you can. Depends how many hands you've got, I suppose, 3, which can be difficult. But we see there in Genesis chapter 12 and verse 9 that Abraham journeyed going on still towards the south. He went south from the land. We get that again in chapter 20 and verse 1, that Abraham journeyed from thence toward the south country. Back in Genesis chapter 12 and verse 10, we read, didn't we, how there was a famine in the land. We don't read of a famine in chapter 20, but in chapter 26 with Isaac, we find that there was one. Genesis chapter 26, verse 1, there was a famine in the land, beside the first famine that was in the days of Abraham. As we saw in chapter 12, Abraham goes down to Egypt. In chapter 20, we read that he went south to Gerar. And so too in Genesis chapter 26 and verse 1, we read that Isaac went unto Abimelech, king of the Philistines, unto Gerar. As we saw in Genesis 12, verse 11, Abraham said to Sarai his wife, Behold, now I know that thou art a fair woman to look upon. We get that in chapter 26 and verse 7, where Isaac says, She is my sister. For he feared to say, She is my wife, lest, said he, the men of the place should kill me for Rebekah, because she was fair to look upon. And so there is that fear of being killed again, which we also get in chapter 20 and verse 11. And Abraham said, Because I thought, surely the fear of God is not in this place, and they will slay me for my wife's sake. And so in all three records, Abraham and Isaac say that their wife is their sister. It's there in Genesis 12 and verse 13. Say, I pray thee that thou art my sister. It's there in chapter 20 and verse 2. Abraham said of Sarah his wife, "She is my sister." And it's there in Genesis 26 and verse 7 that Isaac said, "She is my sister." In chapter 20 and verse 3, we read there how God speaks to Abimelech in a dream by night, and said unto him, "Behold, thou art but a dead man, for the woman which thou hast taken, for she is a man's wife." And likewise in chapter 26 and verses 2 to 6, God speaks to Isaac and tells him not to go down to Egypt, and promises are given to Isaac. We have God intervening in the events which took place. In Genesis chapter 12 and verse 17, we read that Yahweh plagued Pharaoh and his house. In chapter 20 and verse 18, we read that Yahweh had fast closed up all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah. In chapter 12 and verse 18, Pharaoh called Abram and said, "What is this that thou hast done? Why didst thou not tell me she was thy wife?" In chapter 20 and verse 9, Abimelech speaks to Abram and says, "Why, what hast thou done unto us? And what have I offended thee? And what hast thou brought on me and on my kingdom a great sin? Thou hast done deeds unto me that ought not to be done." And likewise too, Abimelech speaks to Isaac in chapter 26 and verse 10. "What is this that thou hast done?" And so we read in chapter 12 and verse 19 that Pharaoh says to Abraham, "Now therefore behold thy wife, take her and go thy way." And so to Isaac is sent away from Abimelech in verse 16, "Go from us," in verse 16 of 26, "Go from us, for thou art much mightier than we." And we read in Genesis chapter 12 and verse 20 and chapter 26 and verse 11 how that both Pharaoh and Abimelech charged their people to not do anything to the men who they were sending away. So we see how that these events took place time and time again. And in these events in chapter 12, we have a type of the events which took place at the Exodus, when the children of Israel were brought up out of Egypt, where Abraham now was. We won't go there now for time, but we read in verse 10, don't we, of Genesis 12, that there was a famine, just as there was in Egypt in the early chapters of Exodus. We read in verse 15 of Genesis chapter 12 how that the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house, was taken in bondage, we might say, just as again Israel were in the early chapters of Exodus. In verse 16 of Genesis 12, Yahweh plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues. And of course we know, don't we, of the 10 plagues that came upon the land of Egypt in the days of the Exodus. And so they were told, in verse 20, they were sent away, just as Israel eventually were by Pharaoh. And they returned back to the promised land, just as Israel commenced their journey. Come with me to the book of Psalms and to Psalm 105. Psalm 105 and verse 6. O ye seed of Abraham his servant, ye children of Jacob his chosen. He is Yahweh our God, his judgments are in all the earth. He hath remembered his covenant forever, the word which he commanded to 1,000 generations, which covenant he made with Abraham, and his oath unto Isaac, and confirmed the same unto Jacob for a law, and to Israel for an everlasting covenant, saying, Unto thee will I give the land of Canaan, the lot of your inheritance. When they were but a few men in number, yea, very few, and strangers in it, when they went from one nation to another, and from one kingdom to another people, he suffered no man to do them wrong. Yea, he reproved kings for their sakes, saying, Touch not mine anointed, and do my prophets no harm. And we see, don't we, how those things were played out in those chapters, Genesis 12, 20 and 26. How that God was there, suffering no man to do them wrong, reproving the kings, Pharaoh and Abimelech, for the sake of those which he had made that covenant with Abraham and with Isaac. And so in Genesis chapter 12, despite that seeming dip in Abraham's faith, God was still there. God was still working to bring about his plan and his purpose. Those promises which had been made would be fulfilled. Abraham had been promised that he would be a great nation. He could not be killed in the land of Egypt, but would be increased with sheep and oxen and asses and men servants and maid servants and she asses and camels, and was very rich in those things. Yes, God was still working with him at this time. Come with me to the book of Hebrews and to Hebrews chapter 11 as we bring our thoughts to a close. Hebrews chapter 11, and here in this catalogue of those faithful of old, we come in verse 8 to Abraham. By faith Abraham, when he was called to go out into a place which he should after receive for an inheritance, obeyed, and he went out, not knowing whither he went. By faith he sojourned in the land of promise, as in a strange country, dwelling in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked for a city which hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Verse 13, these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For they that say such things declare plainly that they seek a country. And truly, if they had been mindful of that country from whence they came out, they might have had opportunity to have returned. But now they desire a better country, that is an heavenly. Wherefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he hath prepared for them a city. Yes, Abraham left Ur of the Chaldees in faith, not knowing where he went. He entered into the land, dwelling in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob. He was not mindful of that country from whence he had come out. He could have had opportunity to have returned. When that famine came, he could have gone back to the Chaldees, back to his father's house. But he didn't. He had left those things behind. He was not mindful of that country from whence he had come out, which was desiring that better country, that heavenly. And so, brothers and sisters, we'll go back to where we started, with those two sons of Eber. The sons of Joktan, who built their own city and a tower to make their own name. And the line through Peleg that went on to Abraham, looking for that city which is to come. That city, that which we have been called from. We're in the same situation, aren't we? Abraham was called from Ur of the Chaldees, so too we have been called out of this world. If we think of it, we have an opportunity too to return. Let us ensure that we are not not mindful of that country from whence we have come out, that we come out and be separate and touch not the unclean thing, as we read in Corinthians. Let us not follow the example of Joktan and his descendants, who are cut off in the scriptural record after building themselves a tower and a city, building themselves a name. But let us follow the example of Abraham, that one who was called by God, not to make his own name great, but God promised that to him. We read there in verse 16 of Hebrews 11, wherefore God is not ashamed to be called their God. That word called is elsewhere translated to be surnamed. Rather than looking to make ourselves a name, are we looking to be surnamed with our God? That God is not ashamed to be called our God, having prepared for us a city. Yes, brothers and sisters, are we building ourselves a city and a tower or a name? Or are we coming out of that country, dwelling in tabernacles, looking for a city which hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God? Are we desiring that better country, that heavenly country, that God might not be ashamed to be called our God, having prepared for us a city?